Mexico's cattle industry had to adapt to significant changes after the U.S. first closed its border to imports of cattle in November of 2024 due to rising detections of New World screwworm. Since then, Mexico has had to expand its domestic beef processing to account for cattle remaining south of the border. In late March, USDA Secretary Brooke Rollins said USDA is evaluating a plan to gradually reopen the border to cattle imports from Mexico. The reopening would happen in phases, with the Douglas, Arizona port being the first to reopen due to screwworm being detected only within 800 miles of the border. An official did announce that is expected within this next month. From what we've observed over this past year, though, the border closure reshaped trade flows, and reopening it may not fully reverse those changes. U.S. cattle imports destined for feedlots fell 74% in 2025. That accounted for about 1 million head of cattle less than usual coming from Mexico. As a result, Mexico's cattle slaughter contracted by 3% in 2025 due to the border closure and a backlog of animals retained. Cattle slaughter, though, is forecast to rebound by 5% in 2026 after redirecting over 1 million head into domestic feedlots. Increased domestic slaughter is expected to support a 6% increase in domestic beef production. That will likely pressure retail beef prices in Mexico, allowing for higher domestic consumption as consuming purchaser power increases for lower and middle income households. What isn't consumed, though, domestically will be exported. Mexico's beef exports increased nearly 5% to 315,000 metric tons in 2025. And the USDA forecasts exports to rise another 6% in 2026, with shipments set to increase particularly to the United States. Even with fewer feeder cattle crossing north, the U.S. will still benefit through other channels, beef imports, and feed exports. What isn't clear, though, is if the latest trend will shift back to the norm we saw pre-screwworm era. It's likely a border reopening will shift some cattle back north, re-entering southern U.S. feedlots. However, economic viability and processing efficiencies post-reopening could keep feeders in Mexico. Slow herd rebuilding in the United States and limited feeder cattle imports will likely keep upward pressure on cattle prices throughout this year. Additionally, U.S. corn exports could see continued demand from Mexico after having benefited from the prolonged border closure. U.S. Census data shows that shipments are running about 40% ahead of last season, with exports to Mexico up about 8% alone, and that growth could continue. The USDA's Foreign Agricultural Service forecasts Mexican corn imports to rise by 1% in the upcoming season due to expanded livestock production, though not just for cattle. The U.S. is expected to supply over 99% of those imports. Even if the U.S. reopens the border to Mexican cattle, the trade flow may not fully return to its old pattern. Mexico has spent the last year building up its domestic feeding and processing capacity, meaning some cattle may continue to stay south of the border while still supporting U.S. beef demand through boxed beef exports and feed grain imports. Thanks for watching. I'm Dawson Schmidt, and this has been a special report from Trader PhD.